Jean, it is the 14th of March, 2001. You're a 58-year-old school teacher living in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Your name is Eduardo. You have taught mathematics for 31 years. Your apartment on Avenida Corrientes is modest, but paid off. Your pension account, the one the government told you was safe, the one you were legally required to contribute to for 3 decades, holds the equivalent of 68,000 US dollars. That is everything. That is your retirement. That is the plan you built your entire second half of life around. Every month for 31 years, money left your paycheck automatically. You never missed a contribution. You never asked questions. You did exactly what you were told to do. This morning, you made café con leche, as you always do. You read the newspaper. You noticed some headlines about government debt. You assumed it was political noise, the kind that always gets sorted out eventually. You have seen political noise before. You are not worried. You are 2 years from retirement. You have $68,000 in your account. You're going to be fine. If you have ever wondered why pension systems that took decades to build can collapse in what feels like a single weekend, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before across multiple countries, multiple continents, and multiple decades. It always begins the same way, and it always ends the same way. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. 8 months after that morning coffee, Eduardo walked to his bank and found it closed. The government had frozen all accounts, and within 2 years, the pension fund he had paid into for 31 years had been raided, restructured, devalued, and effectively hollowed out. He did not retire at 60. He went back to tutoring teenagers in mathematics until he was nearly 70. Not because he failed, not because he made bad decisions, but because the system he trusted with his future had failed him. He was failed in ways he never saw coming and was never warned about. This video is about pension collapse, not as a future possibility, not as a political talking point, but as a recurring historical event that has already destroyed retirement security. This has happened to tens of millions of people across the world. We are going to walk through how it happens and why people never see it coming. We will look at what the warning signs look like in hindsight and what history tells us about who survives and who does not. This is not a prediction. This is an autopsy of patterns. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about pension systems. Most people who are inside one have never been told the true mechanics. And once you see the mechanism, you cannot unsee it. A pension system is not a savings account. That is the most important sentence in this entire video, so let it land. When you put money into a traditional pension, especially a government-run defined benefit pension, which promises a specific monthly payment when you retire, your money does not sit in a vault with your name on it. It gets spent. It gets invested. It gets loaned to the government in the form of bonds. It gets used to pay current retirees right now, today. This works with the assumption that future workers will pay for you when your time comes. This is called a pay-as-you-go system. Think of it like a bucket brigade fighting a fire. Water is passed down the line, bucket by bucket, from workers to retirees. The system works beautifully as long as there are always more people passing buckets than people receiving water at the end. The problem, and this is the crack in the foundation that every pension collapse in history has shared, is that the bucket brigade is getting shorter. Demographics change, birth rates fall, people live longer. The number of workers supporting each retiree shrinks. And at the same time, the promises made to retirees often stay the same or get more generous. This is because politicians who make pension promises are rarely the ones in office when those promises come due. A pension promise is a perfect political tool. It costs nothing today. It buys votes today. And the bill arrives 20, 30, 40 years later when someone else is in charge. The rot is never in the surface. It is always in the beams. This brings us directly to the first major case study in pension collapse history. It is one that most people in the English-speaking world know almost nothing about. It happened in Argentina. It did not start with Eduardo's frozen bank account in 2001. It started much earlier, in the quiet decade before. The warning signs were visible but ignored. Argentina's pension system by the late 1990s was already under severe strain. The country had gone through a structural reform in 1994, shifting from a pure pay-as-you-go model to a hybrid system. This included private pension accounts. This sounds responsible. This sounds modern. But the transition created an immediate funding gap. A shortfall meant money going out exceeded money coming in because current retirees still needed to be paid under the old system. Worker contributions were now flowing into new private accounts instead. The government papered over this gap by borrowing and borrowing more. By 2001, Argentina's debt-to-GDP ratio reached levels that most serious economists considered unsustainable. The country owed more than it could realistically ever repay without severe pain. When the financial crisis hit in full force in late 2001, the government did something that stunned pension economists around the world. It did not just freeze bank accounts, it forced private pension funds to exchange their holdings for government bonds, essentially converting retirement savings into IOUs. These were issued by a government that was simultaneously defaulting on its debts. The private pension funds were absorbed into the crisis. In 2008, the government went further and nationalized the entire private pension system, absorbing roughly $29 billion in assets. For people like Eduardo, the effect was devastating. A system they had paid into for decades was gone, not stolen in a bank robbery, gone through technical legal maneuvers that ordinary people could not follow, announced in language they could not parse. It was executed by officials who reassured them at every step that everything was being managed responsibly. The floor gave way quietly, and by the time most people felt it, the fall was already over. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If you learned tomorrow that your pension fund had quietly invested 40% of its assets in government bonds, would that concern you? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. The second major case in the history of pension collapse brings us to Eastern Europe, specifically to Hungary in 2010 and 2011. It reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how democratic governments can dismantle retirement security in plain sight while receiving no attention. Hungary had built a mixed pension system in 1998, similar to Argentina. Workers contributed to both the state and private funds. By 2010, those private pension funds held approximately 12 billion euros in assets. It was their money. They had earned it. Then came a choice. The Hungarian government, facing fiscal pressure and a significant budget deficit, presented workers with an option. They could keep their private pension accounts, but if they did, they would lose their right to receive a state pension when they retired. In other words, stay private and get nothing from the state. Return to the state system and hand over your private savings. The framing made it sound like a choice. It was not a choice. It was a transfer under duress. More than 97% of Hungarian workers transferred their private savings to the state. The government collected 10 billion euros. They used them to reduce the official deficit, making numbers look better while eliminating the private retirement cushion of an entire generation. This happened in a European Union member state in 2010 and 2011, and it generated barely a ripple of international concern at the time. A pension fund is a pool of capital that the government can see. It is documented and governed by laws that the government writes. When a government faces a severe crisis, that pool of capital becomes tempting through confiscation, conversion, dilution, or inflation. This brings us to Germany in the early 1920s. To pay war debts, the government printed money, causing hyperinflation. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A worker who contributed for 30 years found their pension could not buy a single egg. Each collapse follows the same path. Generous promises, changing conditions, crisis, and modified rules that leave ordinary people with nothing. It is not a fire. It is a river changing course, quietly, geologically, and visibly. By the time most people notice, the riverbed is already dry. And here is the detail that should not be overlooked. In every single one of these historical cases, official voices were reassuring until very late in the process. Argentine officials described the pension nationalization as protecting workers. Hungarian officials framed the transfer as giving people security. German officials throughout 1922 described the inflation as manageable and temporary. The reassurance is not a sign that things are fine. In the historical record, it is often a sign that the people in charge already know things are not fine and are managing the flow of information to prevent panic that would accelerate the very collapse they are trying to delay. Now let us look at who actually bore the cost of these collapses, because this is the part of the story that most economic summaries skip over, and it matters enormously for understanding what is happening today. In every major pension collapse on record, the damage was not evenly distributed. It fell with devastating precision on a specific group of people. Middle-class workers with moderate savings who had followed the rules and done everything correctly. Consider Argentina again. The wealthy in Argentina had long diversified their assets internationally. Dollar accounts in Montevideo, property in Miami, investment accounts in Switzerland. When the Corralito, the account freeze, hit in December 2001, wealthy Argentines had already moved much of their wealth outside the reach of the system. The very poor, paradoxically, were also somewhat insulated, not because they had protection, but because they had almost nothing in the formal system to begin with. They had never trusted banks. They had never contributed significantly to pension funds. They had already been surviving outside the system. It was the middle, the teachers, the engineers, the civil servants, the nurses, the accountants, who lost the most. People like Eduardo, people who had modest savings, who trusted institutions, who believed in the system because it had been presented as trustworthy, because their parents had trusted it, because their union representatives had told them it was safe, because the government kept reassuring them until the end. In Germany in 1923, the hyperinflation destroyed what historians call the Mittelstand, which means the middle class, literally the people standing in the middle. These were small business owners, skilled tradespeople, minor professionals, pensioners who had saved responsibly in bank accounts and government bonds. The inflation did not distinguish between the thrifty and the reckless. It destroyed the savings of anyone who had kept wealth in the currency. While debtors, people in corporations who had borrowed heavily, found that their debts evaporated in real terms as the currency lost value, savers found that everything they had accumulated did the same. In Hungary, the workers who transferred their private pension savings to the state in 2010 were largely middle-income earners who had been participating in the reformed pension system in good faith since 1998. They were not speculators. They were not gamblers. They were teachers and engineers and bus drivers who had done what they were legally encouraged to do and then found that the legal framework had changed around them. The pattern is consistent across nearly every historical case of pension collapse or impairment. The people most harmed are those in the productive middle of the economy who have accumulated enough savings to lose, but not enough diversification to be protected. And the institutions they trusted did not fail them all at once. They failed them gradually, through a series of individually explainable adjustments, until the cumulative effect became clear. By then, it was too late to make different choices. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. The historical record does show, however, that not everyone was destroyed by these events. Some people came through pension collapses and currency crises with their financial foundations intact, and the historical record reveals certain characteristics. They were about knowledge, positioning, and timing. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. Note carefully that what follows is historical observation, not financial advice. Every situation is different, and nothing here should be interpreted as a recommendation. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any financial decision. First, survivors diversified the form of their savings across multiple systems. This does not mean simply different accounts or different funds, because different funds inside the same system are exposed to the same systemic risk. It means savings held across genuinely different systems, different jurisdictions, different asset classes, different institutional structures. People who had some wealth in land, some in foreign currency, some in the formal pension system, were less devastated than those with a single system. In Germany in the 1920s, those who owned real property fared significantly better than those who owned paper promises, because the land remained land. Second, survivors paid attention to leading indicators rather than official statements. In Argentina before 2001, there were measurable signals available in public data: rising government borrowing costs, capital flight from the banking system, declining foreign reserves, a widening gap between official and street rates. None of these required insider knowledge to observe. They were in the newspapers and in the public financial data. The people who recognized these signals and acted on them by moving savings partially out before the freeze were not prescient. They were attentive. The people who ignored the signals often did so because official voices kept telling them the signals were being misread. Third, survivors maintained what economic historians sometimes describe as financial optionality, which means they preserved the ability to make choices. People locked into a single pension system with no other savings, no real assets, no access to foreign markets, had no options when the crisis arrived. Their lives were determined entirely by what the system decided to do. People with some combination of real assets, diversified savings, and human capital, skills that remained valuable regardless of what the currency did, retained the ability to adapt, adjust, and eventually rebuild. None of these three characteristics guaranteed safety. History records survivors and victims across every income level, but the pattern is consistent enough across enough different historical episodes that it is worth understanding clearly. Now, let us return to Eduardo, the 58-year-old schoolteacher in Buenos Aires, who began the story with a cup of café, con leche, and $68,000 in a pension account he had spent 31 years building. Eduardo did not retire at 60. By 2003, his pension fund had been through nationalization, restructuring, and partial repayment in bonds worth far less than their face value. His $68,000 had effectively become a fraction of that in real purchasing power. He continued teaching. He took on private tutoring students on weekends and evenings. His wife returned to work part-time after years at home. They sold a small piece of land they had owned outside the city, which turned out to be one of the most fortunate decisions they had ever made. Land held its value in ways their pension account did not. By 2008, Eduardo had partially rebuilt, not to where he expected to be, not to the comfortable retirement he had planned, but to something workable. He eventually retired at 68, 10 years later than he had planned, with a monthly income smaller than he had expected, and a life that looked different from the one he had imagined, but was still a life. His story is not a tragedy in the simple sense. It is something more instructive. It is the story of what happens when an ordinary person builds their future on a promise that the system cannot keep. And Eduardo's story is not unique to Argentina. Versions of it appear in the economic histories of Japan, where the pension system has been under structural stress for decades as the population ages. They appear in Greece, where pension cuts imposed during the financial crisis reduced retirement payments by as much as 45%. They appear in the United States, where estimates from the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation suggest multi-employer funds face insolvency without restructuring. They appear in the United Kingdom, where the gap between promises and assets in public sector funds is one of the largest unfunded liabilities in history. The pattern across history is not that pension systems are inherently fraudulent or that governments are maliciously deceiving people. The pattern is more subtle and more important than that. It is that pension systems make long-term promises based on assumptions about demographics, investment returns, and economic growth that almost never hold perfectly over 30 or 40 years. The assumptions are not lies when they are made. They are projections. But projections made in favorable conditions often prove unsustainable. The people who bear the cost of that gap are almost always ordinary savers, rather than those who designed the system or profited from it. Pension collapse is not a sudden event in most historical cases. It is a slow divergence between what was promised and what can be delivered. It is managed and papered over and delayed by successive governments until it cannot be delayed any further, and then resolved through some combination of benefit cuts, currency devaluation, asset seizure, or system restructuring. All framed as responsible management, all landing most heavily on those who had the least ability to see it coming. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. The historical patterns described should not be interpreted as predictions about any specific country, pension system, or individual outcome. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making any financial decision about your retirement savings or your financial life. The goal of this video is historical understanding, not personal guidance. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. They will say their system is different, their government is trustworthy, their pension fund is protected by laws that cannot be changed. And they may be right. But if one person in your life is trusting a system they have never actually examined, if someone you know is building their future on a promise whose mechanics they have never looked at closely, share this with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one. History reveals that preparation is the only defense against the inevitable shifting of economic frameworks and system promises. Thank you for watching and for considering these historical lessons as you navigate your own financial future.